Professor Gerald Steinberg, will present his findings on the subject this week at the Institute for Counterterrorism World Summit that is being held at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. He joins us now in the studio. Thank you so much for coming in, Professor Steinberg. So this is a sneak preview. To what extent is Hamas funded by Western governments?
I don't want to overplay this because, in fact, they do get a lot of money from Qatar. We've seen that, and from other sources within the Middle East. But the fact that they're getting any money, and we don't know exactly how many million, but they're getting a significant amount of money from various Western charitable groups, and that's a real problem. It's an extension of the lack, what we call the lack of due diligence. European governments in particular spend tens of millions, in some cases a lot more than that, on various humanitarian and charity aid groups for the Middle East. The one that we've looked at is called Islamic Relief Worldwide. It has an annual budget of £27 million. That's a huge amount of money which they distribute ostensibly for welfare, but in fact, about 2 months ago, just at the beginning of the latest round of fighting in Gaza, after the teenagers were killed, the Ministry of Defense issued a determination that Islamic Relief Worldwide, in fact, is also a channel for funding for Hamas. We know that there are similar groups, IHH, Union for Good, others, Dawas, Islamic charities that operate in Europe, in the UK in particular, but throughout Europe, Belgium, other countries as well, as charitable groups. They're regulated as charities, and the Israeli military, the Israeli security services, through a very detailed legal process, has determined that they are in fact funneling money to Hamas, other groups to Hezbollah, other groups perhaps to ISIS and elsewhere. So the problem here is really a lack, I wouldn't say a deliberate decision by European officials to fund these groups, but rather a real lack of responsibility and due diligence.
Notable Western governments, and who refuses to give?
We don't know about anybody refusing to give, but certainly there's money coming from the British, from the entire European Union, that's 29 governments, from also from a number of United Nations bodies, so that's every taxpayer is paying something for these organizations, and those are all part of the problem. The fact is that, in fact, we've asked all these governments to explain and to provide evidence that their money is not being used for Hamas, and what we get is just a wall in our faces. Freedom of information was denied by the British government on this issue, citing commercial interests. It makes absolutely no sense.
Professor Steinberg, does Hamas have, as far as you know, any accountability to those who give it money? And what do they show for the money spent, of course, besides rockets and terror tunnels?
Well, usually what they say, they're not going to tell their donors in Europe that they're spending the money on rockets and terror tunnels, but they will say, oh, they're using the money to help people economically. But in fact, what we see in Gaza is exactly that. We see the biggest industry is the rocket industry. When you can send 4,565 rockets from Gaza over to Israel in 50 days, where is that? Who's paying for all this? It's a big industry. The terror tunnels, the concrete is being used for terrorism. So while they say that this money is being used, and I think here's the real problem with all of these charitable organizations, humanitarian and human rights group, in fact, no European government has any way of really tracing where the money goes once it gets into Gaza. It's a black hole. The organizations will give them reports, like UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, will give them a report. The money was used for this many school children to get these many books, but there's no way of checking it, and then we see the results.
Professor Steinberg, you just mentioned Hamas weapon smuggling tunnels and the rocket attacks. There are reports today in the media indicating that Hamas has already begun to rearm by smuggling weapons and, of course, starting to rebuild terror tunnels. Based on what you know, are these stories credible?
Well, I don't have any inside information. I hear the same reports others do, but there was a denial of that by a security official, Israeli military official today. I'm a little cautious. It's only been a few weeks since the latest ceasefire. I'd say that it would be difficult for them to do much in terms of rearming in that short time period, but I think we do have to be very concerned that Hamas is certainly not finished, and their main goal is still wiping Israel off the map. We have not seen that change take place. Despite all the talk, there's going to be a donors conference. I think the Norwegians are running this. The Europeans, a lot of this activity means the Europeans really have to become more serious about their involvement and look at what actually happens and not what they want to happen, what their image is of. And we see what's happening in Europe as part of that process.
Professor Gerald Steinberg, thank you so much for being our guest.
Thank you.